So far, we've pretty much only talked about basic shapes, but what you want to draw is probably more complicated. So in this video, we are going to address the idea of starting with a basic shape and then refining it into your final object. And this is all the stuff we talked about in part 1, so I'm not going to go back over the rules themselves, but it's simply taking a shape, like here I'm going to take sort of a rectangular prism, and then I want to intersect a cylinder through it. So I'll think about each shape and how they intersect. And being able to draw something like this by now should be a little bit more simple. And I'll put a little rendering on top, and there you can see the form. Well, this basic form you could think of as maybe a cannon or some sci-fi building, because right now there's really no sense of scale or details. Okay, let's do another one. This time I'm going to start again with the rectangular prism. This is a good standby, but I'm going to put sort of a rounded roof on top. Again, these are just basic operations that we talked a lot about in the first series. But who knows what this shape could be turned into? This basic shape could be really the foundation of a much more interesting 3D concept art. Okay, we'll do one more here, and you see I like starting with these rectangular forms. It's because it's just a good bounding box to contain more complex objects with. But here I've put sort of a sloped ramp on the edge. These are the kind of shapes that you should just get used to drawing, because this can be refined into really anything you want. In order to take basic shapes and begin to sculpt details into them, you have to get good at getting a feel for these flat surfaces. So for this basic example, I've taken something with really obvious flat surfaces. Now generally you're going to be drawing your objects transparent like this. But then you have to envision them as solid objects, because you're going to be sculpting right into those flat surfaces. So here I'm just doing a little doodling, sort of low relief sculpting right into this main form. One of the important skills here is being able to make sure that you're drawing in parallel. So here I'm just doing little cutouts and inlays. These are the kind of details that real world things have. If you just look at machines, they have lots of little variations on generally flat surfaces. So if you just practice detailing out some basic shapes, this is really the way that you work with mechanical objects. Really, most things that are man-made have generally flat surfaces, large planar areas that are then on a small scale detailed out. As a result, getting used to drawing on these big flat planes and adding details is something that's really going to serve you well. And this is where perspective gets really freehand. You notice I'm not even thinking about vanishing points at all anymore. The low detail shell has given me the whole roadmap. Now I just follow it. So if I wanted to get to something complicated like this sci-fi vehicle, it's really no more than simple cubes and cylinders. So I'll start with a rectangular prism, just like the earlier examples, and then I'll begin to divide it up. So these little hash marks tell me where I think I'm going to put my wheels. And I'm just using those rules we talked about, measuring and dividing in the first series, and they're basic operations. But you just get used to thinking this way in 3D. So I have no idea what this is going to look like at this point. I'm just sort of designing. I'm thinking, yeah, there's probably going to be some wheels, and here I'm working symmetrically to make sure that it can be mirrored properly in space. And now I'm just carving. So here I'm going to sort of round off this top edge to give it more of a cylindrical fall off on the top. And I'm just cutting and trimming. Again, each operation is very basic, but this is how you work in 3D. It starts simple, and then slowly you cut and trim and end up with something much more complicated. Because ultimately you can still picture the sort of general box form that this started as. But as I add more and more details, it stops being a shapeless box and becomes a sci-fi vehicle. But so much of this image was really decided in that initial box. The rest was really just polish. So here, let's do another example. Here I'm starting with not a box, but a box with sort of an angled backside. And I'm thinking it's going to have some jets, maybe like a sci-fi spaceship of some sort. But then I hit this moment, and this is an important moment. I like to think of it as a major shell. This is the shell that's going to contain the primary shape in my composition. Now, I don't actually draw it in blue with my real image. This is just sort of what I picture. But once I've hit this moment, I'm pretty confident that I can move forward and that the rest will just sort of fall into place. So oftentimes, the next thing I'll do is think about the center line. So here I'm going to think about what the profile of this shape really looks like. So I'm just sort of designing on the go. Now, if this were a face, I'd be designing the profile of a nose and lips and forehead. It would give character to the person. It'd be a unique shape. But now in 3D with a spaceship, it just helps me kind of lay out a foundation for the rest of my design. So following the rest in freehand here, I'm just using basic operations. Sometimes I'll use the stroke marquee technique to do a cylinder. Sometimes I'll work in freehand. The fact is there's no perfect way to do perspective. Whatever works best for you, whether it's done by hand or using a couple different pieces of software, that's great. Really, after you get used to perspective, you're not going to sweat the details so much anymore. It just becomes a functional tool to envision 3D shapes on the page. So once again, going from simple to complex, here I've ironed out enough of the general forms of my shape that I'm really just detailing. So here I'm just thinking in terms of sort of interesting graphic design shapes. Sometimes you might have to be more careful about function, but now I'm really just sort of detailing and thinking about what looks cool. I'm conscious of the contrast between large flat areas and then small areas of concentrated detail. It's nice to break up your forms in this way. And here, as I worked, I kind of messed up the center line, so I want to make sure that it overlaps correctly. And if you're working digitally, stuff like this is so much easier than it was traditionally with a pen and paper. Once again, we've gone from a basic shape, added some form and polish, and then we end up with a piece of concept art. But you can see that that basic shape that we started with, all we did was refine it. So let's try another thing from a different angle this time. We want to make sort of a tent from the top down. Once again, I'm going to start with a basic rectangular prism. So this is sort of the footprint of my object. I'm going to take this and begin to add form and define it. Now I know I want the tent to have sort of angled edges. So I'm using the basic rules that we talked all about in part 1 of the perspective series. This sort of constructing in 3D is not a problem. Very simple. What it becomes a question of is, what do I want this tent to look like? Well, this here is the shell. So this is the moment where I know, okay, I've got it. The rest is just going to fall into place. And then I can confidently start adding detail. Now this is going to have some repetition. So here I just drew one of the spans across the top of the surface, and then I duplicated it 3 more times, because I knew I wanted each one to look the same. And this sort of repeated element is really good for man-made stuff. When we build things, we like to use repeated modular pieces. So it's good to put those into your designs. You can see it didn't take long to take a pretty basic primitive shape, add some structure and small-scale details, and then give it a little polish. But it was all decided in the shell. This is basically the tent. The rest is just working out the details. If you've been watching Control Paint for long, you know that I'm a big proponent of working simple to complex. Well, working from this shell is a really great example of this. Almost every time I draw in perspective, this is how I start. So in the next video, we're going to take this same idea and apply it not to a single object, but to an entire environment.